or not 50, it's, let's see, 47 years. Now they want to go back and take the country again? Sorry, doesn't work that way.
So did you see that the Truth Social that Trump did yesterday about, he said that all the other countries around there, including the US, they need to like stop crying and learn how to fight for themselves or something like that?
Well, that's kind of rich because, you know, the whole idea.
Can you find that X post so we can find out what it exactly says?
I was working on the Gulf at the CIA before there was any American presence there, with the exception of Bahrain. Yes. You know, I was on Piers Morgan a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, yeah.
And one of the other guests on the panel, well, there were four of us, Scott Horton and I on the one side, and the other side was Alan Dershowitz and General Danny
I saw
Ayala.
this.
and the general, he had been the head of Mossad. And he's like chuckling and laugh. Like I would say, Israel spies on the United States. Oh, he would laugh. Oh. And then Piers Morgan says, does Israel spy on the United States? No, not since Pollard got caught. Then the prime minister said, no more spying on the United States. And I said, General, with all due respect, that's just simply not true. I joined the CIA in 1990, and literally on my first day, we were warned about Israeli espionage against the United States.
What year was Pollard caught?
He was caught in 95.
95, okay.
And then I said, through the 1990s, the FBI identified 187 Israeli spies in the United States. 187.
That if the president calls and says, listen, I want you to take a really hard look at, Brazil.
He can tell the president go screw himself.
Not in so many words.
Right.
But he can just so slow roll this response that by the time he feels like getting around to it, the president's long gone. And I realized for the very first time, there actually is a deep state. We can call it the state. Yeah. We can call it the federal bureaucracy. But by God, it's there. It exists.
No, that's a good question. And I'll answer it by telling you a story.
That the president finally released the remaining documents. And he said, no, he didn't. I said, yeah, he did. He was compelled by law. Congress passed a law twice compelling the president to release all documents related to the Kennedy assassination. He said, there are 10,000 documents that are never going to be released. And I said, why? Wow. And he said, because every single one of them points directly at Israel. And I said, oh man, that's not one that I was thinking of. He says that the Israelis were so angry that A, John Kennedy wouldn't give them nuclear technology. But more importantly, B, he was actively trying to disrupt the Israelis from acquiring nuclear technology. And they decided they had to take him out. Very little known, small cemetery in very far upper northwest, not even northwest, it's right on the northwest-northeast line at the very top of North Capitol Street. So another block and you're in Maryland. And it's called the Old Soldiers and Sailors Home National Cemetery. So there's a nursing home there that was set up during the Civil War for people who had lost legs and couldn't care for themselves. And when they died, they were buried in the cemetery next to the nursing home. There are 23 or 27 Congressional Medal of Honor winners there. They weren't very interesting to me because you go on the Medal of Honor website and it's like, killed lots of Indians, killed lots of Indians, killed lots of Indians. Well, that's just not interesting. So I'm wandering around the cemetery and there are about 15,000 burials there, which is quite small for a cemetery. There's one woman. One. So I was like, well, who's this woman? Agnes Bukowski. Russian sleeper agents in Northern Virginia, including one in my neighborhood, were disrupted and arrested. So what a sleeper agent is somebody who is trained as an intelligence officer, who is then sent to the United States or the UK or Brazil or Paris or wherever, and told to just get a job, any job, and be a national of that country. And so you've got people who, in the case of what happened in Washington recently, one was an elementary school teacher, and one worked for an airline. Everybody thought they were Americans, And in fact, they're collecting classified information, mostly from US defense contractors, and secretly transmitting it back to Russian intelligence in the evenings. They were disrupted and expelled from the United States. Is chief of disguise a real job? You bet it is. They have the most fun in the world. On the day that I got hired, I was sitting with two other brand new officers, and I sat down. I said, "Hi, my name's John. It's nice to meet you both." They said, "What are you going to do here at the agency?" I said, "I'm going to be an intelligence officer. I have degrees in Middle Eastern studies. What are you guys going to do?" The woman said to me, "Oh, I just graduated from the Falls Church, Virginia Academy of Beauty." Academy of Beauty. She ended up becoming a master disguise maker. And the guy on my left was a cartoonist for his college newspaper. He drew a little cartoon. Straight answer on that. I have heard through the grapevine that the Brazilians kind of use a heavy hand in some of the things that they do, but that's really the extent of my knowledge of the Brazilian intelligence service. My apologies. Magic Human says, what do you think of the new Chinese mega embassy opening in London? Do you think it's a threat to the UK? Yes, I do. I've been following this issue. The Chinese tried the same thing in Washington, and we said nothing doing. So they're kind of split up. They have a large-ish embassy on a street of embassies. They're directly across the street from the Israelis. They're down the street from like the Vietnamese and the Qataris and, people like that. But their housing is in a different place, just off Embassy Row in the Kalorama neighborhood of Washington. They're sort of split up. The trade mission's in a different building. And so this harbor master reported to Mossad for years. He never had any idea that he had been recruited by Mossad. Wow. That's a false flag. He thought he was working for a consortium of French businessmen.
That's crazy.
But that's the more likely false flag.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I just see the people who are the advocates for this war, a lot of them trying to paint this fear-based narrative.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
How Islam is going to be the majority religion in the world by like 2030 or something like that. And it's already like it's the second biggest religion in the U.S. right now, second biggest in Canada, Australia, the UK, and all this stuff. And by 2030, they're going to be it's going to be the Muslim majority, and we should all be terrified. But it's like, I don't know. From my perspective, it doesn't seem like the Muslims are a huge threat to us.
They're not. No, that's why I get a kick out of these state legislatures that pass laws banning Sharia law. Mm-hmm. Like, why?
Right. They're not imposing it on anybody.
No, nobody. Do you know what Sharia law is? Right. So Sharia law is, for example, if the head of the household dies, Sharia law says that the wife gets half of the estate and the sons get the other half. That's Sharia law. Sharia law says, yeah, that's it. Sharia law says,
so they're driving through Amman, and he said it occurred to him that
maybe John didn't get him a limo.
So he says to the driver, "Where are we going?" And the driver says,
"The Royal Palace. His Majesty is a huge fan."
And he said, these enormous iron gates open up, and they pull into the Royal Palace grounds,
and here's the king. And he's standing with the director of the Jordanian intelligence service.
I was asked by headquarters, I was overseas in the Middle East, and I was asked by headquarters to target one specific officer of this foreign country. Target? Yeah. Hi, how are you? Okay. Oh, we've never met. I'm John. So nice to meet you. Let me take you to lunch. He had access to information that we really needed. So they told me to accidentally bump into him. So I surveilled him for a week. And he was single, and on Saturday morning, he went to a coffee shop. So I go into the coffee shop, and I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me, and I said, "I know you."
All across the country. But they're Israeli. And we're going to probably give them 95% of that tech anyway. So nobody does anything about it. And then he just goes, ho, 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 ho. Like, okay, you caught me. And then Dershowitz, flipped out like a crazy person.
Right.
And when I said that I believed, and I always couch I'm always very cautious when I talk about this issue. I say, I believe that Epstein was an Israeli access agent. And I lay out what I believe is a convincing argument for that. And I'm happy to repeat that here. And Dershowitz flipped out and he said, if he was an Israeli access agent, he would have told me I was his attorney and I could have gotten him off. I could have gotten him less time. And I said, by confessing to espionage, you could have gotten him less time? I would have hung him from a gallows if he had been an Israeli access agent and he admitted to it. So, who knows? My position is, and forgive me if I keep repeating myself, but if you are a foreign intelligence service, especially the Israelis, who have access to all aspects of American society, right? If you're an Israeli intelligence officer and you want tightly, closely held information that somebody like Bill Clinton has, or Bill Gates, or Alan Dershowitz, or, Prince Andrew, you're not going to recruit any of those people because they don't have traditional vulnerabilities that a CIA officer.
So when I was in Pakistan, I was the chief of counterterrorism operations. Extraordinarily high stress, high threat job. And the hours were ridiculous. Like if you worked only 12 hours a day, people would want to know, you feeling okay? Like what's the problem, right? So I would get in around 7 in the morning thinking I'm going to work until 8 or 9 anyway. So I'd get in at 7 in the morning. We had something called a trunk line where the unclassified phones in the office were connected to a Washington exchange. So even though I'm in Pakistan, I've got a 202 number, and I can dial a 202 number like a local call. So I would get in before everybody else, and I would always call my then girlfriend, my post-divorce girlfriend, who became my second wife. She was a senior CIA officer. So I would always end our conversations by saying, okay, love you, mwah, and hang up. Yeah. And one of the old timers, there were 7 old men who worked for me. They were all like very senior intelligence service level officers. All of them had been at least director of Near Eastern operations. One of them had been the deputy director of the CIA. And they all volunteered to come back as contractors after 9/11 just for patriotic reasons. But if you're a contractor, you can't have a management position. So they worked for me, which is...
That must have been interesting.
I learned more from those guys in 6 months than I learned in the rest of the entirety of my career. But anyway, one of them heard me finish the call and hang up. And he says, so, are there wedding bells in the future? And I said, oh, I don't know. I just got divorced and I'm kind of afraid of being a 2-time loser. And he says, 2-time loser?
Agnes Bukowski. Maybe she was just married to the guy in charge. Maybe she's nobody. So I started to research her. Oh my God, what a fascinating story. It turns out she was married to the guy who ran the place. That's why she's there. But that has nothing to do with her story. She was born in 1897 in Washington and wanted to become a librarian. And the First World War broke out. And her parents said, maybe you shouldn't be a librarian. Maybe you should be a nurse. She said, yeah, that's probably a better idea. So she goes to Bellevue Hospital in New York City, the famous Bellevue Hospital. Now it's a mental institution. They had a nursing program there, and she became a nurse. And as soon as she graduated, she joined the Red Cross, and they sent her to Italy to care for severely wounded American soldiers. And as soon as she arrived, she was assigned to care for a severely wounded American ambulance driver by the name of Ernest Hemingway, who she called Ernie, 19 years old. And they immediately began a torrid affair that lasted for 4 months. And then she broke up with him. And she married an Italian lieutenant. Well, by then Hemingway had recovered and was transferred out. They never spoke to each other ever again. But in 1926, he wrote his first short story. He published his first short story. And she's the lead character. And then in 1932, he published The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and she's the lead character again. And then his masterpiece, A Farewell to Arms, she's the lead character. And it turned out that she's the lead character in 6 of his books. She later went on to divorce the Italian, and she married this American colonel who was in charge of the nursing home.